Imagine a man so powerful that he could bend the rules of society to fit his own desires. A man who built his empire not only with steel and sweat, but with control, dominance, and an obsession that spiraled into one of the most disturbing family stories America has ever known. This is not a tale of a normal businessman. This is the story of a steel baron who defied every boundary, who shattered every norm, and who left behind a legacy of wealth wrapped in shadows, whispers, and pain. Picture a mansion filled with dozens of women, each called a wife, each bound to him by power, wealth, or fear. Picture the sound of dozens upon dozens of children, voices echoing in the halls, competing for attention, for love, for a piece of the man they all called father. 31 wives, 89 children, one man, one empire, and a legacy so dark that even today it feels more like a nightmare than history. In the golden age of American industry, when steel meant power and fortune, there lived a man who was not satisfied with just wealth. He craved immortality through legacy, and for him, legacy was not just a name carved in steel bridges or tall buildings, but through bloodlines multiplied to an almost unbelievable number. He lived in an America that was still growing, a land of opportunity. But he twisted that opportunity into something strange, something unsettling. For the public, he was a man of vision, a leader in steel. For those who dared to look closer, he was a man consumed by obsession, driven by desires that would give birth to America's most disturbing family. At first glance, his story feels like a myth, like an exaggerated tale whispered in dark corners. How could one man possibly marry 31 women and father 89 children? How could such a thing exist in a country that prides itself on law, on order, on morality? But the truth, as unsettling as it is, happened not in secret jungles or faraway kingdoms, but right here in the heart of America. And what makes it even more disturbing is how much of society looked the other way, how power and money gave him the freedom to build this twisted empire of family without facing the consequences that any ordinary man would. Imagine walking into his mansion for the first time, the grand steel gates opening not just to wealth, but to chaos. Women lined across the hall, some young, some older, all carrying the same heavy look of resignation. Children running through the corridors, their faces carrying fragments of the same man. Yet each one different, each one lost in the crowd of siblings too large to comprehend. In every corner you feel the presence of control. In every whisper you sense the fear. And in every story told by those who lived it, you hear the echo of a man who believed he could shape his own kingdom within the walls of America. What drove him? Was it greed? Was it ego? Was it the hunger for power so great that one wife, one family, one life was never enough? Or was it something deeper, something darker, a desire to be remembered not for what he built with steel, but for what he created in flesh and blood? As the years went by, his family grew, not like a tree with branches, but like a forest swallowing itself, tangled, suffocating, and impossible to manage. Wives began to compete, children began to fight, and what he had once painted as his vision of greatness turned into a nightmare of jealousy, secrecy, and brokenness. This is not a love story. This is not the tale of a man misunderstood. This is the chilling reality of how power, when unchecked, can turn into something monstrous. The steel baron thought he was building a legacy that would outlive him, but what he really built was a prison for those tied to him, a prison of bloodlines and broken hearts. Every child carried his name, but few carried his love. Every wife bore his ring, but few ever felt his loyalty. And as the numbers grew, so did the shadows that followed him. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine being one of his children. You wake up in a massive house, surrounded by dozens of brothers and sisters you barely know. You call them family, but deep down you feel invisible. When you run to your father, hoping for a moment of warmth, you find him surrounded by other children, by other wives, by chaos that never ends. You wonder if he even knows your name, if he even remembers your face. And slowly, you begin to understand that to him, you are not a soul to love, but a number to count. The outside world, of course, had its whispers. People in town spoke of the steel magnate with his countless wives, his endless stream of children, his larger-than-life persona. Some called him a visionary, others a madman. But what no one could deny was the hold he had over his empire. Money can silence questions. Power can bury scandals. And for years he lived untouchable, the king of his own kingdom, the master of his disturbing family. But beneath the surface, cracks began to form. Jealousies turned into fights. Secrets turned into scandals. And slowly, the empire of love and loyalty he claimed to have built revealed itself for what it truly was, a cage of control, manipulation, and despair. This is the beginning of our journey into his life, his family, his empire of 31 wives and 89 children. Over the next chapters, we will step inside his world. We will see how he rose from nothing to become a steel baron, how his obsession with power extended not only to his business, but into his own home, and how the legacy he left behind is not of greatness, but of one of the most disturbing families in American history. Prepare yourself, because once you step into his story, it's hard to come out without questioning just how far one man's hunger for power can go. Every legend has a beginning, and this man's story did not start in luxury. He was not born into royalty, nor did he inherit an empire of steel. His beginnings were humble, even ordinary, the kind of life where survival meant hard work and sacrifice. But deep within him burned a fire, a hunger that wouldn't rest until he had carved his name into history. He watched the world around him and realized early on that power was not gifted, it was taken. And the weapon he chose to claim his power was steel. In an America rapidly transforming during the industrial age, steel was not just a metal. It was the backbone of progress. Bridges rose, railroads stretched across the land, cities reached higher and higher into the sky. Steel was the future, and those who controlled it controlled the destiny of a nation. He was no fool. He knew that. In steel lay the keys to wealth, influence, and untouchable authority. And so, step by step, deal by deal, he built his empire. At first, he was just another ambitious man in a world full of dreamers, but unlike the others, he refused to stop. Failure was not an option. He clawed his way through setbacks, fought rivals who underestimated him, and bent rules that stood in his way. As his wealth grew, so did his confidence. He bought land, factories, and people's loyalty with the cold efficiency of a man who saw the world not in terms of relationships, but in terms of assets. To him, everything had value, and everything could be acquired. Workers sweated in his mills, entire towns came to depend on his money, and slowly, the name of the Steel Baron began to spread. Some admired his vision, others feared his ruthlessness. But everyone knew his empire was becoming impossible to ignore. But money was never enough for him. The empire of steel gave him respect, but it did not give him the kind of immortality he craved. Buildings rust, companies fall, empires crumble. He wanted something more permanent, something that could not be destroyed by fire or time. He wanted a legacy in flesh and blood, a dynasty so large it would stretch beyond imagination. Just as his mills produced steel without end, his family would multiply endlessly, carrying his name into eternity. That thought began as a whisper, then grew louder until it became the obsession that would shape the rest of his life. The rise of his empire brought him into circles of influence most men could only dream of. He dined with politicians, shook hands with industrial giants, and surrounded himself with men who wore suits but lived like kings. And yet, in the privacy of his thoughts, he felt untouchable, like a man chosen by fate to leave behind something greater than steel. When he looked at his factories, he saw only temporary monuments. But when he looked at women, he saw the possibility of legacy, of building a family so vast that no one could ever erase his name from history. His first marriage was simple enough. At that time, no one thought much of it. A successful man, a young bride, a beginning to what most expected would be a conventional life. But for him, marriage was never about love or companionship. It was about expansion. One wife became two, two became three, and soon whispers began to spread. In a society where marriage was sacred and family was small, he was already breaking the mold. And yet no one dared to stop him. He was too powerful, too wealthy, too essential to the growing city that relied on his steel. Who would question the man who held the very backbone of America's progress in his hands? For every deal he struck in business, he seemed to strike another in his personal life. A new wife, another household, another set of children. His empire of steel grew parallel to his empire of family. While workers poured molten metal into molds, he poured his ambition into women who carried his name and bore his children. And with each birth, with each wedding, he felt his immortality expanding. But this rise was not without shadows. Many saw him as ruthless, a man who treated people like tools, discarding them once their usefulness had ended. Rivals described him as a wolf in a suit, a man whose smile concealed a hunger that could never be satisfied. And those closest to him, his first wives, his earliest children, began to feel the weight of being part of something much larger than themselves, something they could not fully understand. His world was one of contradictions. By day, he was the respected steel magnate, a man whose vision built cities and created jobs. By night, behind closed doors, he was building something much stranger, something far more disturbing. To the public, he was a hero of industry. To those in his home, he was a man obsessed with control, a patriarch whose desires overshadowed everything else. As the empire grew, so did the silence around him. Journalists wrote flattering articles, politicians shook his hand, and neighbors avoided asking questions. Power has a way of making sins invisible, and his rise was the perfect example. The more steel he produced, the less people cared about the growing number of wives in his mansion or the endless stream of children who bore his name. But deep inside, he knew exactly what he was doing. This was not an accident. This was not simply a wealthy man indulging himself. This was his plan, his vision, his twisted form of greatness. He believed his wealth gave him the right to shape the world in his own image. And as the years passed, the man who once struggled in the shadows of poverty transformed into a figure larger than life, a steel baron by day, and the architect of America's most disturbing family by night. His rise was complete. He had conquered business, tamed rivals, built an empire of steel. But the most shocking part of his story had only just begun, because as powerful as he was in the world of industry, the empire he was about to create inside his home would be far more controversial, far more haunting, and far more destructive than anything forged in his mills. In the beginning, it seemed almost ordinary. A successful man marrying a young woman, building a household, creating the foundation of what many believed would be a respectable family. His first wife was not just a partner, she was the symbol of stability, the anchor that a rising industrialist was expected to have. She entered his life with dreams of love and loyalty, unaware that for him, marriage was never about romance. For him, it was about power, control, and expansion. What she thought was the beginning of a shared life was, in reality, the first stone in the empire of family he planned to construct. At first the whispers were faint. A second wife joined the picture, and those closest to him raised their eyebrows. Was it greed? Was it betrayal? Or was it simply the arrogance of a man who believed the rules of society did not apply to him? He never explained, and he never apologized. To him, marriage was not bound by sacred vows. It was a transaction, a way to extend his influence, to multiply his legacy. And so, the second wife became part of his growing household. Imagine being the first wife, watching another woman move into your home, sharing the same husband, the same space, the same man who had once promised himself only to you. At first, there might have been anger, perhaps even hope that it was a mistake or a temporary indulgence. But as days turned into months, she realized this was not a mistake. This was who he was. This was his plan. And slowly, that anger turned into silence. That hope turned into resignation. She was no longer the center of his world. She was simply one among many. The third wife arrived soon after. By this point, whispers became conversations. Neighbors speculated, friends grew uncomfortable, and the community quietly judged. Yet, no one dared to confront him. He was too powerful, too wealthy, too important. The steel magnate could do as he pleased, and everyone knew it. The wives, however, could not escape the truth. Each of them entered the mansion with the belief that they were special, chosen, perhaps even loved. But reality stripped those illusions away. In that house, love was a rare currency, and loyalty was demanded, not earned. Inside the home, tensions began to grow. The first wives lived under the same roof, their lives overlapping in ways that bred jealousy and competition. They competed for his attention, for his favor, for the scraps of affection he occasionally gave. One might win a smile, one day, another a gift the next, but all of them soon understood that they were not partners, they were possessions. He did not see them as individuals with dreams and needs. He saw them as vessels of his legacy, bearers of children who would carry his name. To outsiders, it may have looked like a grand life. Wives adorned in jewelry, children well-fed, and a mansion that seemed to hold abundance. But behind closed doors, there was tension, whispers of betrayal, quiet tears in the night. The first wives bore the heaviest burden. They remembered a time before the others arrived, a time when they believed in the promise of loyalty. Now, they lived in a reality where that promise was shattered, where every new wife was another reminder that they were never enough for him. The Steel Baron carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. When questioned, he dismissed criticism with ease. He told his wives it was his right, his duty even, to build a large family. He painted himself as a man chosen by destiny to create something greater than ordinary men could comprehend. And though his words may have sounded like justification, in truth, they were commands. His wives had no choice but to accept, for leaving him meant leaving behind not only wealth but security, family, and in many cases, the very future of their children. In quiet corners of the mansion, the wives found themselves bound together, not by love for their husband, but by shared pain. They whispered to each other when he was away, their voices heavy with sorrow. Some of them grew cold, their hearts hardening to survive the life they had been forced into. Others clung to small moments of kindness, fooling themselves into believing that perhaps in some way he did care. But all of them understood the truth. They were part of something larger than themselves, something they could not control, something that stripped them of the individuality they once had. As more wives entered the household, the first wives faded further into the background. Their children, too, were overshadowed by the endless stream of new sons and daughters who followed. Once, they had dreamed that their children would carry a legacy of greatness. Now, they feared their children would be forgotten, lost in the crowd of siblings too numerous to count. What was once a family now felt like a kingdom ruled by one man whose word was law, whose desires shaped every life under his roof. For the Baron, these early marriages were only the beginning. They were the test of his power, proof that he could bend society to his will without consequence. And with every new wife, with every new child, he grew bolder. If the first wives had hoped that the arrival of another woman would be the last, they were quickly proven wrong. There would be many more, dozens more. And with each one, the weight on their shoulders grew heavier. The silence in their hearts grew louder, and the life they once imagined drifted further and further away. The first wives were the foundation of his disturbing family, but they were also the first casualties of his ambition. They were the ones who learned earliest that love in this house was an illusion, that marriage was not sacred, that family was not a bond but a tool. And though they stayed, though they endured, they carried the scars of betrayal that no amount of wealth could ever heal. What began as a marriage turned into a contract. What began as companionship turned into competition. And what began as hope turned into a nightmare that would only grow darker as more wives entered the picture, and as the disturbing empire of 31 wives and 89 children began to take shape. What began as a ripple soon became a storm. One wife became 2, then 3, then 4, until the idea of marriage itself lost all meaning. What most men cherished as a sacred bond, he treated as an unending contract, one he could sign again and again without hesitation. Each wedding was less about love and more about conquest. He did not ask whether society approved, because society's rules had never mattered to him. His power was his shield, his money, his weapon, and with them he carved out a family so large that it seemed impossible to believe it was real. The mansion swelled with life. Every room echoed with footsteps, with laughter, with arguments, with the cries of newborn children. Servants rushed from one end to the other, struggling to maintain order in a household that grew like a living organism, expanding with every year. A visitor walking through the gates might have thought they were entering a small community rather than a family home. Rows of children played in the gardens, their faces strikingly similar, all carrying traces of the same man. Wives passed each other in the hallways, their eyes heavy with fatigue, some avoiding each other, others exchanging cold glances that spoke of jealousy and rivalry. As the years passed, the numbers multiplied beyond comprehension. 5 wives became 10. 10 became 20. And eventually the house held 31 women bound to him, each expected to bear children, each expected to remain loyal, each expected to accept her place in his kingdom. To him, this was greatness. To him, this was proof of his power, his ability to shape life itself to his will. 31 wives, 89 children, each new birth another reminder that he was more than a man. In his own mind, he was a patriarch, destined to be remembered for eternity. But behind the grand vision was chaos. The wives became factions, forming alliances like soldiers in a silent war. Some clung to him desperately, trying to remain in his favor. Others withdrew into bitterness, raising their children quietly, refusing to compete, but never free from the pain of neglect. Every new wife was both an addition and a threat, another rival in a never-ending battle for attention. The children, too, felt the weight of this strange empire. They grew up not in warmth and affection, but in competition and confusion. For every smile their father gave, there were dozens of faces he ignored. For every moment of affection, there were countless hours of absence. Imagine being one of them, just another voice in a sea of 89. You call him father, but so do nearly 100 others. You look for his attention, but he is always surrounded by more. His time is spread thin, his affection thinner still. And though you carry his name, you cannot escape the feeling that you are invisible, lost in a family too large to ever feel like home. The expansion of the family was not just physical, it was psychological. Each wife carried the burden of knowing she was not the only one. Each child carried the burden of being one among dozens, and all of them carried the unspoken truth that they were part of something unnatural, something built not out of love, but out of obsession. The mansion was filled with wealth, with luxury, with every material comfort money could buy. Yet beneath the surface, there was a deep emptiness, a hollowness that no amount of gold or steel could cover. Neighbors and outsiders looked on with fascination and horror. Some envied his wealth, others whispered about his strange household, but few dared to speak openly. His power silenced questions, his influence erased judgment, and so while ordinary men were bound by law and morality, he was free to expand, his family endlessly unchecked and unchallenged. The wives watched as new faces arrived year after year, each woman entering the mansion with the same illusion that she was special. But soon, they all learned the truth. No one was special. No one mattered more than the man himself. They were pieces of a puzzle he alone controlled, building a portrait of legacy that only he could see. And as the family grew, the wives shrank. In spirit, their individuality erased, their voices silenced beneath the weight of his ambition. Children filled the halls, yet loneliness filled their hearts. They played together, but many felt like strangers. Brothers and sisters too numerous to count, bound not by love but by blood, often fought for scraps of recognition. Some grew resentful, others withdrew into silence, while a few rebelled against the very system that gave them life. The expansion that looked so grand from the outside was, on the inside, a breeding ground for jealousy, conflict, and despair. And through it all, the Baron remained steadfast, proud, and unshaken. To him, every wife was a victory, every child another mark of his greatness. He spoke of legacy as though it were a divine mission, convincing himself that what he was doing was not disturbing but extraordinary. He believed his name would echo through generations, carried forward by the countless children who bore it. Yet what he failed to see was the cost paid in broken hearts, in fractured identities, in the silent suffering of those trapped in his empire. The expansion of the family was his triumph, but it was also his curse. For in trying to build something greater than himself, he created something monstrous, something that would haunt his legacy forever. And as the family grew beyond control, the seeds of tragedy were sown deep within the walls of his mansion, waiting for the day they would surface and shatter the illusion of greatness he had worked so hard to create. Step inside the mansion, and at first glance it feels like a palace. Grand staircases sweep upward, chandeliers hang heavy with glittering crystals, and the air smells of polished wood and wealth. But linger a little longer, listen a little closer, and the illusions begin to fade. Beneath the shine of luxury is something unsettling, a tension that clings to the walls, a silence broken only by the restless sounds of too many lives forced together under one roof. The hallways stretch endlessly, lined with doors that lead not just to bedrooms, but to private worlds of rivalry and resentment. Behind one door, a wife sits quietly, cradling her newborn, her eyes dark with exhaustion and fear that her child will be forgotten among the dozens. Behind another, laughter erupts between a group of children, but the laughter soon turns to arguments as they fight for toys, for space, for a sense of belonging. At the far end of the hall, two wives cross paths. Their eyes meet for only a moment, but in that glance lies the weight of jealousy, of anger, of a rivalry that never ends. The dining hall is vast, a long table stretching further than most could imagine, but even here, order is impossible. Meals are loud, chaotic, filled with the chatter of children and the strained politeness of wives who barely tolerate one another. At the head of the table sits the Baron, the master of this strange kingdom. He eats calmly, sometimes speaking, often silent, his presence both commanding and suffocating. Around him, conversations are hushed. No one dares to challenge his authority, not even in the smallest of ways. To defy him is unthinkable. For the wives, daily life is a constant struggle for position. Some hover near him, desperate for his attention. Others withdraw, choosing the quiet dignity of distance rather than the humiliation of rejection. Alliances form and break like shifting tides. Today, two wives might whisper together in the garden. Tomorrow they might refuse to speak, their bond shattered by jealousy or rumor. The mansion is not a home. It is a battlefield disguised as a household, and every woman must fight her silent war to survive. For the children, the mansion is both a playground and a prison. They run through the halls in packs, their voices echoing against the walls, but each one knows that they are just another face among nearly 90. Some crave their father's approval, waiting for the rare moment when he might notice them, a pat on the head, a nod of recognition. Others give up entirely, retreating into their own worlds, invisible to the man whose blood they carry. Rivalries are fierce. Older children bully the younger, siblings turn on each other in desperate attempts to stand out, and jealousy festers like a wound that never heals. At night, the mansion takes on an even darker tone. The halls grow quiet, but the silence is heavy, filled with unspoken words. In one room, a wife cries softly into her pillow, careful not to be heard. In another, a group of children whisper about their father, about the unfairness of it all, about how they wish they were seen, loved, chosen. Shadows stretch across the walls, and the mansion feels less like a home and more like a cage, beautiful on the outside, but suffocating on the inside. The servants too feel the strain. They move quietly, their eyes lowered, doing their best to keep order in a house where order is impossible. They hear the arguments behind closed doors, the muffled sobs, the sharp words exchanged in the hallways. They see what the outside world does not. The cracks in the foundation of this empire, the pain hidden beneath the surface of wealth. But they remain silent, bound by fear, bound by loyalty, or simply bound by the knowledge that nothing they say could change the reality of life inside these walls. The Baron, meanwhile, carries himself with calm authority, as though none of the chaos touches him. In his mind, the mansion is proof of his greatness, a living monument to his vision. 31 wives under one roof, 89 children filling the halls. To him, it is not disorder. It is legacy. He looks at the crowded dining table and feels pride. He hears the cries of infants in the night and feels satisfaction. He sees the wives competing for his attention and believes it is a mark of his power. He convinces himself that this is success, that this is greatness. But the truth, hidden in the quiet corners and whispered conversations, tells another story. Inside the mansion, love is scarce, but fear is everywhere. Fear of being forgotten, fear of losing his favor, fear of never being enough. The wives wear jewels, but their hearts are heavy. The children have siblings by the dozens, yet many feel utterly alone. And though the world outside sees a grand estate filled with life and luxury, those who live within its walls know the truth. It is a house of sorrow, a house where joy is fleeting, and where the shadow of one man's obsession falls over every life. The mansion stands as a symbol of wealth and power, but also as a prison for those trapped inside. For every chandelier that glitters, there is a tear that falls unseen. For every smile shown in public, there is a scream buried in silence. And as the family continued to grow, so did the tension, the jealousy, and the despair that haunted the lives of those who called the mansion their home. Outside the mansion walls, the world was watching. At first it was only whispers. Rumors passed quietly in church pews, in barbershops, in grocery stores. A man with more wives than anyone could count. A house overflowing with children. A family so large it seemed almost impossible. Neighbors craned their necks when carriages passed, eager to catch a glimpse of the women who lived behind those iron gates. Children in the town whispered to one another that the Steel Baron's mansion was cursed, that strange things happened inside. For many, it was a story too strange to believe, yet too fascinating to ignore. The community around him lived with a mixture of awe and discomfort. On one hand, he was the steel magnate, the man whose money built roads, whose factories gave jobs, whose influence kept the town alive. On the other, he was a figure wrapped in scandal, a man living outside the moral codes that bound everyone else. Some admired him, envying his wealth, his power, and his seeming ability to take whatever he wanted without consequence. Others shook their heads in disapproval, whispering about sin, about greed, about a man who had sold his soul in exchange for a grotesque version of legacy. But whether they admired or despised him, one thing was certain. No one could ignore him. Local newspapers sometimes dared to print stories, thinly veiled with words like eccentric or unconventional. They never called him what he truly was, because to do so was dangerous. He controlled money, and money controlled the press. Journalists who stepped too close found their editors silenced, their words erased before they ever reached the public. But rumors traveled faster than ink. Stories spread of 31 wives living under one roof, of nearly 90 children running wild through the halls of his mansion. People argued about whether it was possible, whether it was legal, whether it was human. And yet, year after year, the whispers proved true. Churches condemned him quietly, speaking of morality and sin without daring to say his name. Ministers preached about the sanctity of marriage, about the dangers of pride, but their words were always veiled. Everyone knew who they were talking about, but no one dared to confront him directly. How could they? He was too powerful, too necessary. His steel empire kept the town alive. His donations funded schools, built hospitals, and kept politicians loyal. To strike against him was to strike against the very lifeline of the community, so they spoke in shadows. Their condemnation reduced to murmurs instead of actions. The townspeople carried a strange duality in their hearts. Many were disgusted by the whispers of his household, but they also depended on him. They needed his money, his factories, his business. And so they lived in a constant contradiction, condemning him in private, yet smiling at him in public. The women of the town pitied his wives, but some secretly envied their jewels, their silk dresses, their lives behind gilded gates. The men scoffed at his audacity, yet some envied his power, his ability to defy the laws of marriage and morality without punishment. To many, he was both monster and idol, sinner and king. Children in the town often crossed paths with his. They saw them in markets, in schools, sometimes in church. But his children stood apart, marked by their sheer number, by their father's shadow that followed them everywhere. Some townsfolk treated them kindly, offering pity to children who had no choice in the matter. Others shunned them, whispering that they were strange, that they came from a cursed house, that nothing good could come from a family born in such a way. And the children themselves, though innocent, carried the burden of their father's choices, like an invisible mark stamped upon their backs. Authorities, too, looked the other way. Sheriffs, judges, local politicians, they all knew what was happening behind those walls. They all heard the rumors, saw the evidence, and understood the truth, but none of them acted. How could they? His wealth bought their silence. His influence kept their hands tied. He paid for their campaigns, for their projects, for their futures, and in return they gave him freedom. In another time, in another place, a man with 31 wives might have been dragged into court, branded a criminal, cast out from society. But here, in this town built on his steel, he was untouchable. There were moments, of course, when outsiders tried to intervene. A journalist from another city once came, determined to uncover the truth. He asked questions, knocked on doors, and scribbled notes in a worn notebook. But he never published his story. Some say he was paid off, others say he was threatened, still others whisper that he simply disappeared, swallowed by the same shadows that protected the Baron. Whatever the truth, one fact remained clear. No story ever broke, no scandal ever spread beyond whispers. The community's reaction was a mirror of human weakness. Some were horrified but chose silence. Some were curious but did nothing. Some were complicit, happy to enjoy the benefits of his wealth while ignoring the cost. And in the end, their silence allowed his empire to grow unchecked. Every time they turned away, every time they refused to act, they gave him permission to continue. And so the mansion swelled with more wives, more children, more chaos, until it became less a family and more a symbol of a society willing to look away from corruption as long as it was wrapped in gold. And yet, even in their silence, the people could not escape the fascination. They gathered in groups, exchanging rumors like currency. They speculated about what life was like inside the mansion, about how the wives survived, about whether the children even knew their father's name. They spoke of secret rivalries, of fights and betrayals, of sadness hidden beneath silks and jewels. The truth was always larger than the rumors, always darker than the whispers. But the whispers were enough to keep the town haunted, fascinated, unable to turn away. The Steel Baron walked through the community with his head high, aware of the whispers but untouched by them. He shook hands at public gatherings, donated money at charity events, and smiled for photographs that showed him as a benefactor, a man of vision, a pillar of society. And the people smiled back, clapping politely, accepting his money, pretending not to know the truth. Behind closed doors, they condemned him, but in public they applauded. In private they shook their heads, but in daylight they bowed. And so, the disturbing family grew not only because of his obsession, but because of the silence of those around him. The community's reaction was not enough to stop him, not enough to save the wives or the children, trapped in his empire. Instead, their reaction became part of the story. Proof that power can blind, wealth can corrupt, and entire towns can choose silence over justice. And with every passing year, as more wives entered the mansion and more children filled the halls, the whispers grew louder, the fascination deeper, and the silence heavier. The community may not have built the mansion, but by turning away, by refusing to act, by choosing to stay silent, they became part of the legacy. His disturbing family was not just the story of one man's obsession. It was the story of a society that allowed it to exist. Inside the mansion, the children were everywhere. They filled the corridors, spilled out into the gardens, and crowded the long dining tables. To an outsider, it might have looked like a paradise for children, so many siblings to play with, so much space to run free. But the reality was far darker. For many of them, childhood was not a time of innocence. It was a battlefield. From the moment they were old enough to understand, the children knew they were competing for attention, for affection, for a place in a family too large to ever feel whole. They were 90 voices in a house where only one voice truly mattered, their father's. And his attention was a prize most of them would never win. He might nod at a son who showed promise, or smile briefly at a daughter who caught his eye. But such moments were rare, fleeting like drops of rain in a desert. For the rest, there was only silence. Some children grew desperate for recognition. They tried to stand out, performing tricks, shouting louder than the others, excelling in school just to hear a word of praise. Others withdrew completely, convinced they were invisible, that nothing they did could make him notice them. For every child who fought to shine, another faded into the shadows, swallowed by the sheer scale of the family. Jealousy was everywhere. Brothers turned against brothers, sisters resented sisters, each one fighting for scraps of love and acknowledgement. A simple compliment from their father could set off a storm of rivalry. If he told one son, "You are strong," the others burned with envy. If he praised one daughter's beauty, the rest carried bitterness in their hearts. Love, instead of binding them, divided them. The mansion was full of children, yet many of them felt more alone than if they had been raised without siblings at all. For the older children, the burden was even heavier. They were forced into roles of caregivers, raising their younger brothers and sisters because their mothers were too exhausted, too overwhelmed, or too consumed by their own rivalries to manage. Some older daughters spent their childhoods carrying babies on their hips, feeding them, rocking them to sleep, never knowing a childhood of their own. Older sons were expected to be strong, to be leaders, to prove themselves worthy of their father's approval. Failure was not an option, but success rarely brought joy, it only brought more pressure. And then there was the question of identity. Who were they? What did it mean to be one of nearly 90? Teachers at school struggled to keep track of their names. Classmates teased them, calling them strange, asking cruel questions about their father. The children carried shame wherever they went. They were not individuals, they were curiosities, living symbols of their father's excess. For some, this shame turned into anger. They lashed out, became troublemakers, trying to reclaim control in a world that refused to see them as anything more than one of the Baron's kids. For others, the shame turned inward, crushing them under the weight of a name they never chose. The pain followed them into friendships, into love, into every attempt to build a life outside the mansion. How do you explain to someone that your father had 31 wives? How do you answer when someone asks how many brothers and sisters you have? For many of them it was easier to lie, to pretend, to hide the truth. But secrets have a way of poisoning the soul. The children carried theirs like chains, heavy and unrelenting. Not all of them survived the struggle. Some broke under the pressure, their minds buckling beneath the weight of neglect and rivalry. Depression, anger, and addiction haunted the family as they grew older. A few ran away, desperate to escape the mansion's walls, but escape did not mean freedom. The shadow of their father followed them, a mark they could never wash away. Wherever they went, the questions followed, the judgment lingered, the shame clung. At night, when the mansion was quiet, the children often whispered their pain to one another. In darkened rooms, they shared dreams of what life might be like in a normal family. They imagined a father who tucked them into bed, a mother who had time for them, a house where their voices were heard instead of lost in the crowd. They clung to each other in those moments, bound not by love but by shared loneliness. But when morning came, the rivalries returned, the fights resumed, and the fragile bonds dissolved once again. Some children idolized their father no matter how absent he was. They convinced themselves that if they worked harder, if they obeyed more strictly, if they sacrificed enough, he would finally see them. Others despised him, blaming him for every wound, every scar, every night they cried themselves to sleep. But whether they loved him or hated him, none of them could escape him. He was the center of their world, the figure who defined their existence. His choices shaped every corner of their lives, leaving them powerless to shape their own. The mothers tried in their own ways, to comfort their children. But how much comfort could they offer when they themselves were locked in battles for survival? Some clung to their children, using them as weapons in their rivalries, teaching them to spy, to scheme, to play the dangerous games of favoritism. Others neglected them, too consumed by their own pain to offer love. The children were caught in the crossfire, used as pawns in a war they never asked to fight. And yet within all the darkness, there were fleeting moments of light. A child sneaking away to play in the garden, laughing freely for a moment before the weight returned. A stolen hug between siblings who, for once, remembered they were on the same side. A brief smile from their father, rare and fragile, that gave them hope even when it should not have. These moments kept them alive, but they were not enough to heal the wounds. As the family grew larger, the struggles only deepened. Each new child was another rival, another name to be remembered, another soul competing for love in a house where love was scarce. The older children resented the younger for stealing what little attention remained. The younger grew up in the shadow of older siblings who had already learned bitterness, and so the cycle continued, generation after generation, a cycle of neglect, rivalry, and pain. The struggles of the children were the hidden tragedy of the mansion. To the outside world, they were symbols of their father's power, proof of his legacy. But behind the doors, they were broken, lost, and unseen. They carried scars that would never heal, scars that shaped the rest of their lives. And as they grew older, as they left the mansion one by one, those scars spread into the world beyond, proof that the sins of one man could ripple outward, leaving wounds long after he was gone. Time is the one enemy no man can conquer, not even a baron who once believed himself invincible. For decades, he had ruled his empire with an iron fist, his voice enough to bend men to his will, his wealth enough to silence critics, his presence enough to command fear and obedience. But as the years crept forward, the steel magnate who once seemed unstoppable began to wither. His hair, once dark and full, thinned and turned the color of ash. His back, once straight with pride, bent slightly under the invisible weight of time. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, carried shadows of doubt that he could not disguise. Inside the mansion, the wives noticed first. They saw how he coughed at night, how he sat longer in his chair, how the fire in his voice no longer burned as hot as before. Some whispered that age had softened him, that perhaps he would show mercy now, perhaps he would finally become the husband and father they had longed for. But they were wrong. The decline of his body did not soften his spirit. It hardened it. As his power slipped through his fingers, he clung to control with desperation, ruling his household with greater paranoia, demanding respect even as his strength faltered. He grew suspicious of everyone. Servants who once moved freely now found themselves questioned, accused of disloyalty. Wives who whispered among themselves were accused of plotting against him. Even his own children could not escape his suspicion. He saw betrayal in their eyes, rebellion in their silence, ingratitude in their laughter. The man who had once been feared for his strength was now feared for his instability. His paranoia turned the mansion into a darker place, where every word might be twisted, every action misinterpreted, every moment tinged with fear. Outside the mansion, his decline was also visible. The steel industry was changing. New competitors rose, younger men with fresher ideas and sharper instincts. His empire, once unshakable, began to crack. Contracts slipped away, profits shrank. Whispers spread that the Baron was no longer the titan he had once been, that his time was ending. And as his business faltered, so too did the loyalty of those who had once bowed before him. Politicians he had funded turned to new benefactors. Journalists who had once remained silent began to sharpen their pens. The world that had once protected him began to sense weakness. and weakness was an invitation. Scandals, long buried beneath his wealth and power, began to surface. Rumors of the 31 wives and the 89 children, once whispered only in quiet corners, began to seep into the open. Reporters grew bolder, sniffing around the edges of his story, piecing together fragments of truth that could no longer be denied. Articles appeared in newspapers outside his control, painting him not as a great industrialist, but as a man consumed by greed and obsession. A man who had turned his household into a grotesque experiment. The image he had carefully constructed for decades of a noble magnate, a generous benefactor, a pillar of society, began to crumble. And within the mansion, the cracks widened. His wives, once bound together by fear of his authority, began to see the truth. The man they had sacrificed everything for was no longer untouchable. Some grew bold, speaking more freely, challenging his decisions, no longer trembling at the sound of his footsteps. His children, too, sensed the change. The fear that had once silenced them began to loosen its grip. Older sons questioned his authority. Younger children mocked him behind his back. The empire he had built within his own walls was slipping away, just as surely as the empire of steel was collapsing outside. The Baron himself could feel it. Nights grew longer, his body weaker, his mind clouded with memories of what he had been. He walked through the mansion, but it no longer bowed to him as it once had. His words no longer commanded the same obedience, his presence no longer struck the same fear. He raged at the decline, lashing out at wives and children, punishing servants, demanding loyalty from a household that no longer believed in him. But rage could not turn back time. Power once lost cannot be reclaimed, and so he grew bitter. He looked at his children not as a legacy but as a burden, so many mouths to feed, so many hearts he could not control. He looked at his wives not as symbols of his power, but as enemies, rivals, reminders of his own folly. The very family he had built as a monument to himself now stood as proof of his failure. They did not worship him, they did not honor him, they resented him, hated him, pitied him. His dream of eternal greatness had rotted into a nightmare of his own making. The community, once silent, now whispered more loudly. They saw the decline and smelled blood. Neighbors who had once bowed their heads in his presence now looked at him with disdain, with mockery, with curiosity. Churches that had once spoken only in parables now named him openly as an example of sin. The newspapers no longer hid his name, the scandals were out, and his legacy was tarnished. In his final years, the mansion that had once been a palace of wealth became a prison of sorrow. The laughter of children, once deafening, faded as they grew older and left, carrying their scars into the world beyond. The wives, once adorned with jewels, now moved like shadows, tired and bitter, their beauty fading with the years they had lost inside those walls. The servants left one by one, unwilling to endure the chaos of a house collapsing from within. The Baron, once surrounded by power, found himself surrounded only by the ghosts of what he had built. And when illness finally struck him, when his body gave in to the inevitable, the house did not fall silent in mourning. It exhaled in relief. The man who had once believed himself larger than life, the man who had tried to defy the natural order, the man who had measured his greatness not by love, but by conquest, he lay weakened, forgotten by many, despised by some, pitied by few. The end was not glorious. There was no great farewell, no empire standing unshaken. There was only decline, only loss, only the bitter truth that everything he had built was crumbling with him. The Steel Baron who once thought himself immortal was, in the end, just a man undone not by enemies, but by himself. His decline was not only the story of age, it was the story of arrogance, of obsession, of a life lived chasing power while neglecting love. And as he faded, so too did the illusion he had spent a lifetime creating. When the Steel Baron finally left this world, the earth did not tremble. There were no grand parades, no mourning crowds, no monuments raised in his honor. His death was not the end of a legend, it was the beginning of chaos. For decades, his life had been about control, about bending everyone around him to his will. But in death, that control slipped away, and the empire he left behind began to collapse under the weight of his choices. The moment the news spread, the mansion filled with tension. Wives who had once endured each other's presence now stood as rivals, no longer bound by fear of him, but by greed for what little remained. 31 women, each claiming her place, each demanding recognition, each desperate to secure something, for herself and for her children. Arguments erupted in the hallways, voices rose in anger, accusations were hurled like weapons. Whatever fragile peace had existed while he was alive vanished in an instant. And then came the children. Nearly 90 sons and daughters, each carrying his blood, but few carrying love for one another. Brothers turned against brothers, sisters turned against sisters, families within the family drawing lines in the sand. Inheritance became a battlefield. Some demanded money, others demanded property, others fought simply for recognition. Who would carry his name? Who would inherit his power? Who, among the many, could claim to be the true heir of a man who had spread himself so thin that none of his children had ever truly known him? The lawsuits began almost immediately. Lawyers circled like vultures, picking apart his estate piece by piece. Courts overflowed with petitions, with arguments, with claims and counterclaims. Every wife wanted a share. Every child demanded their portion. But there was not enough to satisfy them all. His once mighty empire of steel had already weakened in his later years, and what remained was far less than what they had imagined. The fortune that had seemed limitless was not infinite after all. And so they fought harder, each believing they had been cheated, each unwilling to accept defeat. The public, meanwhile, watched with fascination. Newspapers printed every detail of the lawsuits, every scandal that emerged, every bitter fight that spilled into the open. The Baron's carefully built image of power and control was gone. In its place stood the truth, a family shattered, consumed by greed, envy, and pain. His legacy was no longer steel, no longer wealth, no longer the empire he had built. His legacy was chaos. The children carried the heaviest burden. Some tried to honor him, clinging to the idea that he had been a great man, convincing themselves that the suffering had meaning. But most could not forget the scars of their childhood. They remembered the neglect, the rivalry, the loneliness. They remembered being invisible in a house filled with too many voices. They remembered the fear, the silence, the hunger for love that had never been fed. And as they grew older, as they tried to build lives of their own, they carried those wounds with them, passing them down like curses to their own families. Some turned to self-destruction, consumed by anger and bitterness. Others drifted into obscurity, desperate to escape the shadow of his name. A few tried to find redemption, breaking free from the cycle of pain, but even they could never fully erase the weight of the past. Wherever they went, people knew who they were. They were not simply themselves, they were one of his children. And that label followed them like a ghost, a reminder that they could never truly escape the man who had shaped their lives. The wives, too, were left broken. Some lived out their days in quiet bitterness, trapped in memories of a man who had promised them greatness, but delivered only sorrow. Others tried to rebuild, to find new lives beyond the mansion, but few succeeded. Most were too scarred, too marked by the years they had lost. They had given everything to him, youth, beauty, loyalty, and in return, they were left with nothing but fragments of a legacy that had turned to dust. The mansion itself became a symbol of his decline, Once a palace of power, it fell into decay after his death. Rooms that had once echoed with the laughter and cries of children grew silent. The walls, once polished and proud, began to crack. Chandeliers collected dust, gardens withered, and hallways grew dark. The house that had been built to showcase his greatness became a tomb, haunted by memories of a family that had never truly been a family. Outside, the community that had once stayed silent now spoke openly. People told stories of the wives they had seen, the children they had pitied, the corruption they had ignored. Historians and journalists painted him not as a hero, but as a cautionary tale. His empire of steel was remembered, yes, but always with the shadow of his disturbing family attached. His name was no longer spoken with respect, but with a mixture of disgust and morbid fascination. And that became his true legacy, not the factories he built, not the wealth he amassed, not the power he once wielded. His true legacy was the darkness he left behind, the broken lives of his wives, the scarred souls of his children, the silence of a community that had allowed it to happen. His story was not one of triumph, but of tragedy, not of greatness, but of greed. For every child who grew up feeling invisible, for every wife who lost herself in the battle for survival, for every neighbor who looked away while knowing the truth, his legacy lived on, not as honor, but as a wound. A wound that stretched far beyond the mansion walls, a wound that echoed through generations. The Steel Baron had once believed he could defy the natural order, that he could build a monument to himself through wives and children, that he could live forever through legacy. But what he left was not greatness. What he left was proof that power without love, wealth without compassion, ambition without humanity, leads only to darkness. And so his name lives on, not as a symbol of strength, but as a warning, a reminder that even the mightiest empires can collapse, that even the wealthiest men can leave behind nothing but ruins, and that the choices of one man can scar the lives of many. His empire of steel has long since faded, but the darkness of his family story still lingers, a haunting shadow in the pages of history. In the end, when all the noise fades, when the court battles are done, when the mansion is silent and empty, we are left with one question. What was it all for? A man who spent his life chasing power, who measured his worth not in love but in numbers, 31 wives, 89 children, an empire of steel that once stretched across America. And yet, standing at the edge of his story, all of it feels hollow. He believed he was building a legacy. He thought that by multiplying his bloodline, by spreading his name across generations, he would live forever. He thought that power could outlast time, that wealth could erase loneliness, that control could replace love. But history shows us otherwise. His name does not echo with honor. His empire does not shine with glory. His story lingers as a warning, a shadow, a reminder of the cost of obsession. Because what he left behind was not unity, but division. Not strength, but scars. His wives, once symbols of his power, lived lives of pain, jealousy, and silence. His children, who should have been his joy, grew up in a battlefield of neglect and rivalry, carrying wounds that shaped the rest of their lives. And the community that surrounded him, neighbors, churches, leaders, remained silent, complicit, in their own way, choosing comfort over courage, allowing darkness to grow unchecked. We call it a disturbing family story, but it is more than that. It is a mirror. It forces us to ask difficult questions. How often do we stay silent when power corrupts? How often do we ignore suffering when it hides behind wealth? How often do we admire success without asking what it cost to achieve it? The Baron's mansion may have crumbled, but the patterns of his life still echo in our world today. Look closer, and his story is not just about one man. It is about the human hunger for power, the dangerous belief that legacy can be built through conquest instead of compassion. He was a magnate, yes, but also a prisoner of his own ambition. Every wife he took, every child he fathered, every brick of his empire was meant to make him immortal. But in the end, mortality claimed him, just as it claims us all. And what he left behind was not greatness, but grief. There is something haunting in the silence of his empty mansion. Imagine walking those hallways now. The chandeliers are dark, the gardens overgrown, the rooms abandoned. No laughter of children, no whispers of wives, no footsteps of servants. Only echoes of what once was. A house that once burst with life now stands as a tomb of broken dreams. If walls could speak, they would tell stories of tears that fell unseen, of fights behind closed doors, of children who cried themselves to sleep. They would tell the truth that money tried to bury but never could, and beyond the walls, his name lingers, but not in the way he imagined. People do not remember him as a hero, but as a cautionary tale. His story is told not in boardrooms as an example of success, but in hushed tones, in documentaries, in whispers about how power without love can rot the soul. His empire of steel has rusted away, but his disturbing family remains in memory, a reminder of what happens when ambition crosses the line into obsession. We ask again, what was it all for? Was it worth the suffering of 31 women who sacrificed their lives to a man's hunger for control? Was it worth the broken childhoods of nearly 90 children who grew up fighting for a father's glance, for a moment of recognition, for love that never came? Was it worth the silence of a town that looked away, the complicity of a society that valued wealth more than justice? The answer is written not in gold or steel, but in scars. And those scars remain. His story is not about numbers. It is not about 31 or 89 or millions in profit. It is about the emptiness that comes when we measure life in numbers instead of meaning. It is about the destruction that follows when we treat people as possessions instead of souls. It is about the truth that legacies are not built on control, but on compassion, not on power, but on love. And so, as we close the final chapter of this disturbing family, we are left with an image. A man who thought himself immortal, a mansion that once glittered with wealth, a family too large to love, too broken to heal, and silence. Heavy, haunting, unshakable silence. History has already judged him. The world remembers not the steel he forged, but the sorrow he left. His name survives, but not in the way he dreamed. It survives as a warning, etched in whispers and stories. A reminder of what happens when ambition blinds a man to humanity. And maybe that is the lesson we must take. That true legacy is not measured in children or wives or wealth. It is measured in kindness, in love, in the lives we touch. The Steel Baron had everything the world could offer, yet he died surrounded by nothing that truly mattered. His empire crumbled, his family scattered, his legacy stained. What remains is the darkness of his story, carried like a ghost through history. A shadow that asks us to look inward, to question ourselves, to ensure that we do not repeat his mistakes. Because in the end, every empire falls, every fortune fades, every life ends. What we leave behind is not our power, it is the memory of how we used it. And so, as the echoes of his disturbing family fade into silence, one truth lingers above. All love builds legacies that power never can.